first of 3 events that we have planned for the Indiana Humanities One State, One Story program. So we are one of 33 states and 33 sites in the state that are hosting the World Wonders book, which is on the poster there. And as part of that, we needed to schedule 3 different events, one of which is a community book discussion in June.
Thank you. It's a delight to be here, and you can thank Becky, my wife, who's sitting in the back, for pulling me out of the garden today, right? and off the fruit tree. So what a wonderful day it is, but it's good to gather in this space as well, and look forward to learning together. The photo up here is, we live in Goshen, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But this is the Elkhart River, very close to where we live on the southern part of Goshen City itself, and of course spring is coming, right? So that's a really good thing, as well as having the flowers that are starting to poke through, which encourages us all. It's also important for us as we begin today, not only thinking about this part of the Elkhart River, but the fact that we have the St. Joe and the Elkhart joining right to the south of where we're sitting here today, to recognize that this is the homeland and watersheds of the Potawatomi and Miami peoples. And we'll talk some about Potawatomi, a little bit about Miami as well. If we go just up to St. Joe a little bit, this is when I was canoeing with undergraduate students on the St. Joe heading up toward Niles. A wonderful morning scene as we're canoeing all the way to Lake Michigan and learning along the way. I could tell you a lot about the fun of that trip. And one of the questions that we can ask today, as well as one that we asked when we were there, is what do we know about the watershed where we live? It's like a roof, right, where it runs off and into the gutters. Like, what do we know about how water runs across our landscape? That's our watershed. And to also ask the question, whose land are we living on? A very interesting question. And how can we pursue regenerative actions as well? So all of these pieces I'm pulling together in what I would call sort of a case study. Things that I have explored myself, things that I have worked at trying to understand, and I'm happy to share those with you today, as well as take questions as we proceed through our time together this afternoon. So this is a photograph of an oak savanna where you have the large oak trees, and because of the leaf canopy, it means that understory is mostly just grasses and flowers that are blooming. That's what makes up a savanna. And where we live in Goshen was an oak savanna. And so this is the context for us to think about several things today. So we'll work our way through these 4 points. So first of all, let's talk about the verdant landscape upon which we all live. A wonderful, wonderful, rich landscape. So as we look at an oak savanna, I want you to imagine 1830. I'm sure as you've toured here, people ask you those kinds of questions. Think about 1830, 1831, 1832. Well, in 1830, a post was put in the ground, and the reference points were made to 2 oak trees. Those were called witness trees. So that this post represents a section corner as the surveyors in 1829 and 1830 were measuring the land on which we live. Well, we happen to live at the intersection of Kircher Road, County Road 38, and Main Street in Goshen. So that's where we live. You actually, those of you in the front can see my orchard right there. Right? That's where I was right before coming here. So a post was put right there. It's no longer there, just in case you're wondering. Right? Somewhere buried out there in the midst of that intersection, it's probably been dug up and so on. But the county surveyor's office knows that that is a section corner. So that we are on the northeast side of the section, and then there's a section up here, down here, and down here. Well, how do we know these things? Well, on my computer, I have over 500 pages of handwritten notes that I got from the surveyor's office here in Elkhart County that are written in this wonderful cursive. You all are having fun reading that? You all had to learn cursive when you were in school, right? And so did I, fortunately. And so if I look closely here, it says at 80 chains. Has anybody measured with chains in them? No? Do you know what a chain is? 66 feet in length. And there are 100 links that make up that 66-foot long chain. So that means each link is like 7.9 inches or something like that. More than you really wanted to know. But if you have 80 chains, that's what this says right here. If you have 80 chains, 80 times 66 is, this is your mental math for the day, 5,280. It's a mile, right? It's a mile. That's what that means. And what you see here is it says that they set a post at this section that I'm just pointing to, and there was a white oak tree 12 inches in diameter, and it says how far away it was from the post. And there was another white oak tree 20 inches in diameter, measured at about this height. So they measured these trees so that they would know where it is. So it gives us an interesting understanding of what was here on the landscape. You'll notice as they headed east between the two sections, so just east on what is Kircher Road toward a railroad track, you actually cross the railroad tracks and you entered a prairie. So they noted features they saw along the way. And then they drew up a map. So here's section 22. This is where we live. Some of you know Goshen College, that's up here. And so section 22, this is Kircher Road, this is College Avenue. Now it doesn't go this way, the section line goes this way, but College Avenue. And you'll notice when you look ahead, it says at 41 links, just past the half-mile marker, right in front of what is Greencroft Retirement Center, is a road to Fort Wayne. This is marked in 1830 already, a road to Fort Wayne. So what does that mean? Well, we'll explore that. So there's a post there, and here is a prairie heading off toward the east, and here is a road going right through Greencroft Retirement Center. What do we know about that road? Well, let's just back up a little bit and say, so why am I so interested in this? Well, part of it is because I enjoy this piece of ground. So this piece of ground we bought in 2013 and started planting an orchard on there. So you see it in that fall, after, just as I was starting to plant. And as I was digging all these holes, I kept asking questions like, so why is the soil like it is? It's amazing. Every hole I dug, there was this topsoil, and then there was a little bit of gravel, and then this coarse sand. Perfect growing medium. So this is 2013, this is 2020. Same view, right? Do you think those plants are happy there? Absolutely. But that made me keep asking more questions. And I asked a friend one day who had worked with surveyors in the county until his retirement. I said, so can you tell me more about my property? So one day at breakfast he came in and Jim laid on the table the abstracts of the property. And I'm reading through the abstracts that were written up. We're not going to read through this, but there it was. And I flipped the page and it says over here that it was signed by President Andrew Jackson. All right? Now there's not a signature, this is an abstract, but it was like, wow, I have a lot more to learn about this land. And so I'll talk about some of those things. And so here's another picture of our place. We call it the Half Moon Rising Fruit Nut and Berry Orchard. But I've also noted that where I am growing vegetables and raising fruit is land where the Potawatomi in Miami for centuries, millennia actually, grew. All right? So I'm acknowledging that. And the bike trail that runs all the way down to the Waterford Elementary School to the south, and then of course all the way, you could actually get all the way up here, goes right within about 20 feet of that sign. So I have fun talking to people along the way. So here we see the Elkhart Township as it was laid out in 1830. Just for reference points there, you can see these various places, my home, Greencroft, and downtown Goshen. We also can look closely, those of you in the front might be able to read that it says Elkhart Prairie there. So this green area is this wonderful, wonderful, rich prairie. Wonderful prairie. And passing through it, this blue line happens to be the road that comes all the way up here, and I'll show you a couple slides of that in a moment. So the Elkhart Prairie was just this incredible place for raising all kinds of food. So this was you might call it the breadbasket for the indigenous people of this region. And so as settlers started coming in, they would see that during the summer, Potawatomi in particular in that area had their summer camp set up, and they were raising their corn, squash, and beans. They were harvesting the medicinal plants. They were hunting and fishing because the river is very close there, the Elkhart River. So it was a wonderful, wonderful spot for them to raise their food and store food for the winter when they would go back to the smaller village area. So raising corn was a very important part of the indigenous people of the Americas, and in particular, even up through this region. Way before the settlers showed up, corn was being raised. Because you do need to remember that Europe had no corn before Columbus came here, right? All corn originates in the Americas. And it was, of course, taken to Europe and to Africa and to Asia, but it all started here. And so the indigenous people had figured out how to have different varieties of corn, some that grew well in a climate like ours, but some that would grow wonderfully down in the Southwest, right? And so a very diverse thing. So collecting wild rice was also an important piece. So Elon Pochedley, just last year, so he's a Potawatomi, citizen Potawatomi Nation member. He's doing his graduate work, and he's been working at where wild rice grew in northern Indiana. Very, very interesting to understand that. We don't have it here at this point because of the drainage of swamps and wetlands and river changes. But it's an interesting piece to think about. And so, as I've interacted and listened to Potawatomi people that I know, they've told me this, that in their story of history, that they were told in several prophecies to leave the East Coast, even before the Europeans arrived. And they should head to the west until they came to the place where food grew on the water. Monoman called wild rice. I grew up in northern Minnesota, and we had wild rice all around us. And my Ojibwe friends and classmates would go out and harvest that. Maple sugaring, another very important activity for folks. And so the indigenous people lived in wigwams. They set up their temporary camps. They worked by the waters. George Winter did a lot of wonderful paintings back in that era, which helps us recall how some things looked and functioned. So as we talk about land, there's several pieces that are important, pieces that I read about as I read indigenous authors. And so what Sherry Mitchell says here is a central understanding. So when indigenous people think about the environment, they think about it in terms of all my relations. I'm related to everything. So as one who also has worked in ecology, we talk about the interconnectedness of everything. And you notice here it says, everything is interconnected. A second point is that land is kin. So looking at the landscape and all the components of it as a relative. And so you see in this bottom line it says, thus we have an obligation to care for the land the same way we would take care of our human relatives. So when it came time for signing treaties, it didn't really make sense, right, to the indigenous people at several different levels. And one of them was this idea that I was giving up a relative, like I'm selling a relative, which we wouldn't think about doing, right? But as we understand the indigenous view of the world and of land, we get to understand that, and it's a very essential part for us to think about. So the Goshen dam pond is here in the foregrounds, and it's a reminder to us that we all live on indigenous landscapes. So let's look where we are. Concord Township, right? Everybody knows that we're in Concord Township. Just saying. I live in Elkhart Township. We all live in Elkhart County, but you're in Concord. So up here is where Ruthmere is. That's where you're sitting by that green star up there. When you look at this map, one of the things that stands out, at least to me quickly, is a river system, right? So you see the Elkhart running up through here. You see the St. Joe coming across here. What's this one?
It's the Yellow Creek. And the Christiana is right up here, just to the north of us, right? So this is the river system. I've just kind of highlighted these areas. These are all called marshes that were in Concord Township that those early surveyors were noting. And then these green areas were prairies. Do you know the name of this prairie? Prairie Street runs right through it, by the way. I don't know how they ever came up with that name, right? Prairie Street runs right through there. This is what was called Pleasant Plain Prairie. And there's a, Becky grew up in Elkhart, she said there's a Pleasant Plain Street.
Yeah.
And I think it must be somewhere down interstate. I think it's an east-west street maybe, right? Off Havilah?
Yeah.
Okay.
It runs north and south.
That's right.
Yeah,
All right,
it's
we're doing good
clear.
on that one. What's this one up here then? It's the 2 Mile Prairie. It's about 2 miles long. All right, so these are, again, so when we talk about prairie, we often think about further west, right? Very far west in Indiana and then on to Illinois, and of course the huge prairies out in the west. But there were many pocket prairies around here, and the indigenous people maintained those with controlled burns. Because if you don't have a regular, which is an important thing for prairie health, if you don't have regular burns, trees will grow up, and soon you don't have a prairie anymore. And so this was, as we were saying earlier, a breadbasket kind of location. As we look closely, we actually recognize that this reddish line is a trail system. This is the same trail that's coming up through Goshen, and now, and so Goshen is, so Elkhart Township is down that way, right? And so it crosses a bit through Jefferson, and then comes up, crosses the river, and comes up here. If you read this map closely, it says road to Chicago. Road to Chicago. And then there was a little spur that goes up here to the St. Joe. And this intersection, some of you know where the Mennonite church offices and Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary happen to be on Benna. Well, this intersection is on the seminary property. So interesting. I mean, there's no marker there yet. That's another story. We're working on that. But so you see that, but you also notice that there's another trail that runs up on the east side of the Elkhart River and crosses just over here. All right? Just on the other side of the bridge, basically, is where it would have crossed through here. So I love looking at these maps and doing these overlays and thinking about that. So here we are today, sitting at Ruthmere, and then when we do an overlay of the map, look how close those early surveyors were. You see the black lines that are overlying this. And then if we zoom in more closely, what I did is I went through those handwritten notes and I wrote down what they noted all along the way. So in August 6th of 1829, it actually came across here, across the top, where I have that blue line, and they had fun crossing in and out of the Christiana Creek over and over again, because it runs right along the northern section line of Section 5 of Concord Township they happen to be in. So now you really know where you're located, right? We're in Section 5, right? And this is 1 mile by 1 mile, and you see, you know, the kinds of trees that were here, the things that we see. There's the road to Fort Wayne, and here's also a road that comes up in here. So those roads, this had to be one of the most challenging sections of Elkhart County because of all the things happening there, right? You have the Elkhart River, you have the St. Joe River, you've got Christiana Creek, all converging there, plus these trail systems coming in. Well, we could just stop there and say that was good, right? So one of the things to note, so looking back here, it says 65 chains and 550 links. And so here's 6550, and what they say, they make a commentary here. Just a little earlier on the previous page, they said, this is a beautiful creek. They often don't put those kind of descriptive words in there, but they were so impressed they actually wrote beautiful down when they saw Christiana Creek. But they say here, it's supposed to have an 18 or 20 feet fall to the mouth, and by a shortcut to the St. Joe River would make a most valuable mill seat. Where did I see a picture? Oh, right back there, right? There it is. guess what? So there's the mill that ended up being put there, and Havilah or Beardsley was one of those early mill founders. So some of you have dug around in the Beardsley history, and there's a kind of a somewhat famous article that was written by his oldest son. And so Edwin wrote this when he was 82 years old. I'm not going to ask if anybody's 82 in here, but you know how it's good to just talk about the old days, right? So when he was 8 years old, his family moved here. Does that sound right for those of you that work in the museum? So, I mean, Edwin was about 8 years old. So he got to see a lot of these things. And so he's writing about how amazing this whole area was. So streams, bottomlands along the streams, prolific in plums, grapes, pawpaws, hazelnuts, black and white walnut, and then huckleberry and hickory nut, deer, black bears, raccoons, squirrels, turkeys, pheasants. Do you see that? Mm-hmm. And down here it says, so abundant, he says, was the wild fruits and game that the simple ones of the Indian were within reach of his outstretched hand, and he lived happily and content with the present and without fear of the future.
Yeah, wow.
Right?
And see how that would happen.
Yeah. That's what I'm doing in my orchard, right? Then he goes on to talk a little bit about what he saw along the river here, where you had the encampments that were set up, so that regularly the Potawatomi were encamped along here, and down here you see Chief Moran camped just on the other side of the river on a regular basis. Well, that gives us a quick understanding of this verdant landscape. Let's move along and talk about disruptions and change that occurs. So let's go back in time just a little bit, right? Something that we call pre-colonized era of America's history. So in the 16,000 years ago time, we know that we have artifacts in Idaho that indicate indigenous people living on the continent. So 16,000 years ago. I just finished reading a book called Origins by a woman who's a geneticist who's writing about the indigenous gene populations and trying to figure out, it's very complicated but fun to read about. And these would be some of the places she refers to. So 13,000 before the Common Era, BCE, human hearts and charcoal were found in California. 3,500 BCE, up in Alaska, you have various villages set up, which is the same time period as the Sumerians were in Babylon. All right, just for perspective, all the way across the Atlantic, halfway around the world, right? What's going on there? So 3,372, the Mayan calendar was made, and it's actually way more accurate than the Gregorian calendar. Let's figure that one out, right? You all pay attention to leap years and when you can't have a leap year and all that kind of stuff, right? The Olmec civilization, it was an Aztecian, a pre-Aztecian, so the Aztecs descended out of them. And then Rome is 753. So it just gives you an idea. Ancient Rome, isn't that what we talk about? Ancient Rome. Now, it doesn't mean that there weren't other things going on in Europe, right? But by perspective, the way we often think about history, this is one of the major points that we reference, and we forget to talk about these up here. And in 1 CE, so Common Era, so we enter the Common Era, we often talk about AD, so CE and AD are basically synonymous with each other. And so here the Hokum are making these amazing canals that still can be seen today. So there are many things we can learn. If you want to dig, have fun reading this book called 1491. And so 1491 is written by Charles Mann, and he's looking at what would we find in the Americas, both North and South America, Central America, of course, before Columbus lands. And then he also has a book called 1493 as well. So that'll keep you reading for a few days at least. And then there's also a Jack Weatherford book called Indian Givers. I actually like the subtitle better, How Native Americans Transformed the World. So we need to understand that in 1300 Common Era, so 1492 Common Era, Columbus, sailed the ocean blue, right?
Yeah.
So 13, we had an estimated anywhere between 65 and 120 million people living in North America.
Well,
Indians.
Yeah, Indians.
Oh.
All different tribes living across the Americas.
Holy cow.
And that doesn't count South America. Now, this is a point that is sometimes disputed. Because how do you know? How do you calculate? And people have worked on this in different ways, and you can do some looking up to see, how you might read and understand this. But we have to also realize that when the Europeans came and then started settling, the diseases wiped out in many populations up to 95% of the people. Right?
wow.
Huge. And so then those people, let's say that, 1550, people are walking out into Virginia. It's like, well, there aren't hardly any people around here. Well, yeah, right, there aren't hardly any people around here because they've died. And so this is an important point from my perspective for us to understand. But we have to understand, in reading these kind of books, we would know that they worked on micro-agriculture, so raised bed gardens. They worked on macro environmental management. So while the Europeans, my ancestors, were domesticating animals, cows and chickens and pigs, etc., what the people of the Americas were doing is they were managing a whole landscape so that it would be productive. So it wasn't like the indigenous people just kind of existed here and roamed around in whatever the ecosystem was. They managed it. Remember what I just said? Like these prairies were burned on a regular basis. Controlled burns. It wasn't just crazy fires. It was controlled burns because they knew how that would strengthen it. A lot of examples. Sustainable agriculture. So they had passive solar. They had water capture systems. The humanities were very, very strong. Psychology, philosophy, religion, rhetoric, language, arts, and ethics. Sciences, math, medicine, surgery, dentistry, and good, healthy waste disposal systems. In fact, when some of the first explorers came into Central America, they realized that those major cities in like Mexico City area had better wastewater treatment systems than Paris did, right? It didn't smell as bad as Paris, in other words. That's another way to say it. And then to remember that 60% of the food that is eaten in the world today has its origins in the Americas. So the corn, the squashes, the potatoes, there were only like 3,500 different varieties of potatoes only, right? Most of those were developed in Peru and so on, but they made their way all the way into this region. Tomatoes, peppers, right? All of these amazing things that we depend on. And sometimes we think about like Italians and peppers and tomatoes, right? Well, yeah, it's because they got the starts from over here. So as we zoom in and look a little bit at our particular area, we see that there's a lot of things going on here. With corn being grown, you see the trading that happens, and that's why this trail system that I'm talking about that runs from Fort Wayne, what's called the Maumee River area, all the way up to the Elkhart St. Joe River area and on to Lake Michigan. That trail was a major transfer route. And there were other trails around the area too that we could talk about. The French, of course, came into this area, but then there was a major disruption during the Beaver Wars because beaver pellets were so valuable in Europe. And so the Dutch actually got the Iroquois people of New York State to help push into this area so that they could get beaver pellets. And so that displaced a lot of people. So the Potawatomi and Miami and Kickapoo from this area moved all the way up into this area to be out of the way. And so this area was somewhat vacated at that point. And when these wars ended up, then the Miami and Potawatomi came back. There were Potawatomi up in this area as well, and the Ojibwe up in this area, and the Ottawa up in that area. But the Potawatomi came back right here in this area, and then the Miami just a little bit further to the south, like toward Fort Wayne, toward Peru, Indiana, etc. It's a fun old map to look at. So, we're over here And to recognize that the Elkhart River's name is the same meaning as the Potawatomi and Miami name for the river, the heart of the elk. All right, so this is the English, and the French had their own part of the elk. I can't say it in French, but you can look at old villages here. You actually can see that on this map, it's marking the trail running over here. You also see a trail over here in St. Joseph County that runs to Detroit. That was called the Sauk Trail, all right? And so there's some markers of that. US 12 is on top of a bunch of that. Okay, another map. We're just kind of skipping through history here. So you all know when the Revolutionary War ended, right? Yes? 18 who? 1784, right, okay. So this brand new government was in debt at the start, right? They owed for the war. They owed people in New England, wealthy people in New England who had helped finance it. They owed people in France, the French government had financed it. And by 1787, there were knocks on the doors of the politicians saying, hey, we need to be paid. Well, this happens to be what's called the Northwest Territory. No, Oregon and Washington is not in this picture. It's because it's north and west of the Ohio River and Mississippi, okay? So this land, which was, according to the British, not to be settled, then was taken to be settled, and it became the bank to pay off the debt. That's a shortened version of a lot of things that happened. That's why the surveyors came in and started laying things out in grid works, mile by mile, section by section, 80 acres here, 80 acres there, right? And then those were sold, typically at $1, $1.25 an acre, is what they were selling it for. By the time Andrew Jackson was president in the 1830s, a lot of this land was being sold, and it was the only time the US government had no debt. They had sold enough of this land to actually pay off all that debt, and then we turned around and got into debt again. But anyway, that's another story, right? So here are four sections, four townships in the southern southeastern part. So Benton, Jackson, Elkhart, and Clinton. So again, reference points, you see the river system, you see the grid on top of it, you see the Elkhart Prairie that was so valuable. And one of the things that you see here is Osbanabi, which is a village where 5 Metals was the chief, Waneoshana, who was the chief at that area. And the road is coming up through here. So in 1812, some people started walking up this road all the way from Fort Wayne, sent by William Henry Harrison. And so this troop walked all the way from Fort Wayne to take on this village because they were upset with what had happened by some members of this village, and they came up, and Colonel John Jackson was a member of that. That's what Jackson Township is, and he's the one who's named after. And so he came up in 1812, and he says, this is so beautiful. He says this in the morning after they had burned down the village with 20-some residents in it, or 20-some buildings in it, where the Potawatomi had left. They knew the troop was coming, so they left, headed toward Detroit, but food was still warm on the fires. This was September of 1812, so they had already stored a lot of corn. They had squashes and potatoes set aside. And he and the others camped out overnight, and he saw this and he said, I'd like to come back and get this, which of course ended up happening. If you're on US 33 in Benton and you're heading south toward Fort Wayne, just before you cross the river, the Elkhart River, you see this plaque that says this is where the pioneers entered Elkhart County. That's a true statement, but it's a very incomplete statement. This happens to be where the indigenous people for millennia had crossed the river, and we don't say that on this plaque. This plaque was put up in 1923 by the Elkhart County Historical Society. And I've talked with them, and we've talked about, well, maybe we need to put up another plaque somewhere to talk about some of the rest. And you all know this, the seal of Indiana, and it represents this huge change that we're talking about. As the buffalo, the woodland bison are fleeing, the forests are being cut down. Well, you know this is southern Indiana, right?
Yes.
The hills aren't up here. But 1816, and the treaties for up here weren't signed until 1821 and 1828, etc. So settled a little later. So here's a map of all the treaties. Let's zoom in. So I live about here in Goshen, so I'm in this particular treaty location, but up here we are in the 117 treaty document. And if you really want to read cursive, read that cursive, because that's the document that was signed in 1821 with the Ottawa, the Ojibwe, and the Potawatomi. So those three tribes or nation groups are all part of one larger Anishinaabe group. And so they related very closely to each other. So the Chippewa, Ojibwe people I grew up with in Minnesota have this connection to the Ottawa and the Potawatomi people. And so if you look here, this is where Pierre Moran is noted as being an owner of a section of land, right? More or less where we happen to be. And so you see all the people who signed it. These are all Indigenous people. You see some of the U.S. people, U.S. government people who signed that. So Matea is one of the persons. So Chief Matea was very eloquent, and some people wrote down what he was saying when this treaty was being signed in 1821. And here's some of what he says. The Great Spirit who has provided for the land for our use allows us to keep it and to bring our young men and bring up our young men and support our families. We would incur his anger if we bartered it away. If we had more land, you should get more. But our land has been wasting away ever since the white people became our neighbors. And we now have hardly enough left to cover the bones of our tribe. And this speech goes on with that same kind of grief of losing this land that had been part of their history for hundreds of years, and in a larger scale, thousands of years. So Isaac McCoy, 1822, so he was a Baptist missionary, and he actually crossed the river right over here. He came up that road we were just talking about. There was no bridge, there was no ferry, so he crossed. They lost a bunch of goods in the river, finally made it across. I don't know at what point he decided to do this, but he named Christiana Creek after his wife. He's on his way to Niles, Michigan. So he had started Indian boarding schools to train Potawatomi in Miami, as well as whites and African American in Fort Wayne. But then in 1822, he came up through here and he started what is by Niles called the Carey Mission. And it's not there anymore except for this historical plaque up there. The Carey Mission was the place where he was teaching agriculture, etc. And one of his views was that we should actually move all the Indian people west of the Mississippi. And he would go and talk to people in Washington, D.C. about this. Well, long story short, that eventually happened, and I'll note that. So here's a treaty that was signed where we live, 1828. And if you really want to read these treaties, I can tell you how to find them. And it is interesting and sobering to read through what that is. So for example, here, in Article 3 of that treaty, which is where we live, it says that Indigenous or Indian people can live in the area provided that no location be made upon the Elkhart Prairie or within 5 miles of the same. Unless you talk to the President of the United States about that.
Wow.
Well, why would that be stated in this treaty? What did I just tell you about the land? Rich, fertile soil, right? And that's where the first settlers, of course, came in. So these are examples of all the treaties signed with Potawatomi people over time. The 1821 is this large area which we are part of. There's the 1828. So Andrew Jackson becomes president in 1829 and starts in 1830 then. And he writes this after the 1830 Declaration of the Indian Removal Act. So he's writing to a friend, and he says this, I'll just read the yellow part there. It was a measure I had much at heart and sought to effect, because I was satisfied that the Indians could not possibly live under the laws of the states. If now they shall refuse to accept the liberal terms offered, they only must be liable for whatever evils and difficulties may arise. I feel conscious of having done my duty to my red children And if any failure of my good intention arises, it will be attributable to their want of duty to themselves, not to me. And so they start moving people. If you're on US 33 in Goshen, 15th Street, there's a stone. This stone marks close to the location where a fort started being built in 1832 because of the Black Hawk War. The fort was never built because the Black Hawk War wasn't anywhere close. And finally they got the fearmongers to stop spreading these rumors, but this stone happens to exist. So this is 1832, and this movement of moving, or the whole process of moving the indigenous Indian people to the west was happening. There was a council where they met with the Potawatomi in 1838, and then in 1838, they started on what's called the Trail of Death. So 850 people leave Twin Lakes. So they gathered people up from around here. So someone like Chief Shipshewana, Indiana, he was gathered up as well. And they were marched all the way to Kansas in September and November. Right? It was harsh. Over 40 people died along the way. And you can read accounts of this as they made this trek through this very difficult, disruptive part of their own experience. And so that was one of many green lines that show the movement. And so the people who lived here, the Potawatomi who lived right where we are in Elkhart County, end up then being down here, the citizen band group in Oklahoma, because they made it to Kansas, and then some years later they were forced to move again down to this particular area. And so here we are, 1874, the atlas shows where we are right up here. This is section 5. You see the layout of the city is happening. All these things start progressing as the settlers come in, and you can read and study that history. And so here we have this interesting overlay of today, the trail system. You see where the wetlands and prairies used to be. The red dots represent section corners across our landscape. I've had the privilege of working with Dr. Kelly Mosteller a number of times via Zoom. So she lives in Shawnee, Oklahoma. She is a descendant from people from this area, and she's the head of their Cultural Heritage Center. Amazing center that they have and work on. And she's giving us some advice and responses as we're working on how can we mark this trail that I've been referring to. And she wonderfully said in one of our conversations, in a very warm and open conversation, but just a reminder for us to think about, she said, this is our land, it is where we lived, it's where our ancestors are buried, and it's a place of our origin stories, where we're from. So just a good, healthy reminder of that. Let's talk for a couple of minutes about disruption, the causes behind it. So 1492, Columbus comes. This is a painting that we could discuss, the painting. But one of the things that's behind all of this is what's called the doctrine of discovery. So in that time in history, the international body making decisions about what happens as the lands of the world are being explored in the 1400s, that international body was the Roman Catholic Church. It made sense in lots of different levels. And so decisions were made. What do you do when you arrive at a place, you discover a place? What do you do? Well, one thing you do is you often put a flag and a cross in place as a marker. But then there's also this understanding that you can seize the indigenous lands because they are not Christian. It goes on to understand that the land is empty, terra nullius. So remember what I was saying about this decrease in population, that was kind of re-fortified, like, well, there aren't any people here, right? But, you know, at the core of this meaning of terra nullius was that if the people are not under a Christian prince, they are less than human, they are subhuman. So when you read the horrific stories of how indigenous people were treated, you can understand that people, the explorer people, were being taught that they're not really people. They're not really people. And so coming out, and this actually started happening as the sailing ships were going down along the west coast of Africa. It's this kind of decision making that gave permission for enslaving people. as well as the genocide things that happened as a result of colonization. So we also talk about manifest destiny. This is a famous painting by John Gass that's showing American progress. This woman, marching to the west, the buffalo fleeing here, the indigenous people moving out, the miners, the trappers, the agriculturalists, the trains, etc., coming in here. Do you know this woman's name? You want to guess who she is? Her name is Columbia. Mrs. Columbus, you might say, I suppose. But so she became a figure that represented this progress. She has a telegraph wire in her hand, right? What do you think's here?
Bible.
A Bible? Actually, it's a school book. So training people was another factor in it. So we could spend a lot of time talking about the picture. But this whole idea even lands when you read, we don't have to believe everything we read on Wikipedia, right? But it's the place we go for a lot of information. And so if you go to the city of Goshen site, it says the New England Yankee population founded towns such as Goshen, considered themselves the chosen people and identified with the Israelites of the Old Testament and thought of North America as their Canaan. So that's why Goshen is called Goshen, as well as a lot of these people, of course, coming out of New England where there were other towns called Goshen. So this whole notion of the European dominance over the area just is reverberated over and over again. If you want to do some searching online, all you have to do is a search for invasion of America, and you'll come up with this map. And this map shows the colonies on this side, but then you can play a little video, and it will show how the treaties are signed and signed and signed and signed. And the red areas happen to be the areas that were called reservations. Then you can also zoom in and click. So like if you zoom in and click right here, that's where you can find the treaty statements themselves. It's a wonderful website for gathering that kind of information. So the whole thing about the doctrine of discovery is not just an old deal. I mean, it is very old, over 500 years, but it also ends up being incorporated into the US law as well. So for example, in 1823, right as this area was starting to be settled and surveyed, in Illinois, there was a man by the name of Johnson who bought some land from a Pinkshop person. And then a McIntosh person, some years later, bought the same land from the US government. So you end up at the Supreme Court. So whose land is it? Well, the Supreme Court made their decision based on who discovered the land. And so they carried over from various European countries, transfers from the French to the British to the Americans, and they said, so the discoverers, by right, is the US government, and therefore it belongs to McIntosh. All right? So that carries over. It was as recently as 2005, the doctrine of discovery was quoted as the Oneida Nation in New York were having a discussion. They had gotten some of their own land, and they said, because it's our land, we no longer now need to pay taxes to the city. But they said, no, the discoverers are the ones who made that decision, not anybody else. And so again, that statement was made. Well, we could go on with that. Let's wrap up, and then I'll take some questions here by just thinking a little bit about learnings and responses that we might have, because we're talking about a difficult history. Things that challenge us, things that sometimes make us uncomfortable, but also things for me that motivate me to think, how do I build good relationships? How do we work today? A friend of mine who lives in Oregon, who's Cherokee descent, Dr. Randy Woodley, made this particular little diagram to show that we start with awareness. So it's the kind of thing we're doing today. And we learn from indigenous people, and we lament the changes that happen. And so, we can confess, but then we move on into acts that are called rehumanizing. So this whole notion that the indigenous people were subhuman kind of just works our way into our system. Whether we want it or not, it works in the way I think, right? And so rehumanizing is an important factor to consider. And then working at memorializing, which is part of why we're talking about marking this trail system. It's important to remember that while the Potawatomi were removed from this area, The Potawatomi still exist today. The Miami still exists today, and you could name tribe after tribe. And on this map, these little triangles represent the places where Potawatomi are organized. It's not that all the Potawatomi live there, but these are the different Potawatomi bands or nations that people are members of. How many of you have gone to the powwow? Okay, great. So this is a wonderful event. It's a very welcoming event. It helps us understand our neighbors to the north. The Pokagon band, they were not forced to leave. And that's a whole nother story, but the Pokagon band stayed. They've ended up purchasing land and continue to work on that. And I've enjoyed working with a number of people there. You can go to this website, which is this Cultural Heritage Center in Shawnee, Oklahoma. And they have developed wonderful videos and web information about their history, both at their center, but you can also access a lot of that online. I've enjoyed working with Miami people as well, and for example, Diane Hunter is their historic preservation officer, and just was on a Zoom call with her during this past week. And so this is another website that tells a lot of stories about their life and work. So learning to acknowledge the land that we were on, and then taking action. So this is a whole guide to do this. Here are a couple things that I have worked on. I'm a member of the Mennonite Church, and so I've worked with a group of people across North America to figure out how do we respond to this. And so this is a website. We've worked on resources for teaching. We've also developed a set of resources of how do we build relationships and repair relationships. And then I called together a year ago a committee of people from Elkhart and Goshen areas to think through how do we start marking this trail system. We have the Lincoln Highway marked, right? Well, and I've met with the person who did a lot of that work, Jeff Blair, for the Lincoln Highway across Indiana. And so we're thinking of marking this trail, and we're starting with Elkhart County. That's where we live, and how do we do that? Where can we put up signage? The Potawatomi, which is the Potawatomi, the English, French kind of changed over names. And these is a logo that we've developed that we're getting really close to being able to use that. We're looking at some kiosks. Next week we actually start developing a website. It's going to take us a while, but we keep working on these various pieces. And so thinking about this wonderful world in which we live, this verdant landscape, this whole creation, to recognize that we all belong, as Randy Woodley says, to a great community of creation, and we are participating in it together here on Turtle Island. All those who are honest about what they see happening in creation have a great ethical and theological foundation for the pressing work of restoring the community of creation. So I'm into restoration. I like to work on that with people as well as the landscape itself.